Welcome to Medmarc's webinar series. Today's presentation is titled DOJ's New Corporate Compliance Evaluation Guidance and the Potential Impact on Life Sciences Companies. On behalf of Medmarc and today's presenter, Matt Wetzel, thank you for joining us. Matt is an experienced healthcare lawyer and advocate providing regulatory, fraud and abuse, coverage and payment, transparency, and compliance counseling to medical device and diagnostics manufacturers, pharmaceutical and biotech companies, and other healthcare and life sciences organizations. Prior to joining Akin Gump, Matt served as Vice President and Deputy General Counsel of the Advanced Medical Technology Association, AdvaMed, the world's largest trade association of medical device and diagnostics manufacturers. Matt holds his JD and BA from Georgetown University. With that, I am pleased to turn things over to Matt, who will begin today's presentation.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks so much to the Medmarc team and to those of you who dialed into the call today. I appreciate the opportunity to share with you some of the information that I've been uncovering about the Department of Justice's recent guidance on compliance program evaluation. Before we begin, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the agenda and telling you a little bit about what I do. Thanks so much, Courtney, for that terrific introduction. As Courtney mentioned, I work with life sciences companies on healthcare fraud and abuse issues and compliance program development, among other areas. With respect to compliance program development, I work to counsel companies that are just looking to start compliance programs, that are looking to assess their existing compliance programs, and that are looking to grow and develop their programs as their businesses grow. And so, of course, when the Department of Justice issued its most recent guidance on compliance program evaluation earlier this year, and we'll talk about that in a minute, I thought this was a good topic to dive into, understand more about the government's perspective on compliance, and thinking through some of the downstream impact on the companies that I represent. So today, we're going to talk about the U.S. government's perspective on compliance, how the government perceives compliance programs, when is a compliance program effective, and this is a highly relevant topic to what's going on in the world today. We see a continued Department of Justice or DOJ interest in the life sciences companies, especially as companies face challenges and tough issues of public trust, the opioid crisis, for example, some of the pharmaceutical pricing issues that we're seeing, manufacturers, relationships with physicians, and the like. And I would also point out that earlier this month, earlier in September, Senator Grassley, who has long been seen as a champion for compliance and compliance-related initiatives in the Senate, asked the U.S. Attorney General Barr for details on the department's recent False Claims Act dismissals. And really, this is important because it all ties back to how the government enforces its anti-fraud and other health statutes. And this inherently involves private sector compliance programs. Are they strong enough? Are they effective? And how does this guidance impact them? So we'll talk a little bit about compliance programs in the MedTech space and the life sciences space. We'll talk about the history and evolution of the DOJs and other government agencies' statements on effective compliance. And we'll talk a little bit about some conclusions about the most recent guidance document that came out. I put 10 or more here in the agenda because some are higher level conclusions than others, but there's a good bit of observation to be made about the government's view here. We'll talk about the impact on MedTech compliance, and then we'll also talk a little bit about industry standards, which are part of the government's discussion when it comes to evaluating compliance programs. So to get started, let's talk a little bit about the role of effective compliance in medical technology and life sciences. So when we talk about the role of compliance, why is it important with respect to the MedTech industry? Well, it's a heavily regulated industry, as you all know. There's limits on behavior, anti-fraud and anti-corruption requirements in the anti-kickback statute, the False Claims Act, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and other areas. There are limits on how companies can promote and market their products under the Food and Drug Administration requirements. There's public disclosure obligations, transparency requirements like the Sunshine Act, privacy obligations, reimbursement obligations, not to mention all the other areas of regulation that other industries face, trade, environmental health and safety, and the like. This, as you all well know, better than perhaps most, is an industry subject to significant litigation, and by that we mean government enforcement of criminal and civil matters, and also private party litigation, products liability issues. Standard practices and other industries may be verboten in MedTech, and here we're talking about things like gift giving, meals, very simple day-to-day business courtesies that in other industries are standard practice, not really much thought about, but in our industry, in life sciences and in MedTech, are areas that require some difficult decisions. And then government expectations. The Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General expects life sciences companies to have effective internal compliance programs. They've issued guidance in the form of compliance program guidance for pharmaceutical manufacturers, which also applies to medical device companies, countless corporate integrity agreements that contain compliance obligations, advisory opinions, special fraud alerts, and the like. All of these demonstrate the government's expectation that we as an industry will have compliance programs. So how can compliance help address these issues? Well, first, compliance serves as a set of preventative measures and an infrastructure that's intended to avoid and eliminate fraud, waste, abuse, and corruption. Compliance is really intended in part to demonstrate to internal stakeholders that the company takes legal obligations seriously. And by that, it sets the right tone of ethics and integrity for doing business as an internal ethical matter, internal cultural matter rather. Compliance provides a pathway for internal stakeholders to ask questions and to understand appropriate practices. It shows to external stakeholders that the company has these internal controls in place, it's taking a measured approach to compliance, it has the right cultural tone and the like. And then also, this emphasis on integrity and ethics is becoming increasingly important to customers, consumers, and shareholders. So having spent a little bit of time, just an overview of compliance and what does it mean, let's talk a little bit about the background, history, and background history and evolution of how DOJ has looked at compliance. And why does it matter what DOJ thinks? Well, first, DOJ looks at a company's compliance program to decide whether certain misconduct was a fluke, a one-off, an abnormality, an aberration, or whether it was part of a systemic problem at the company. Second, DOJ also decides how to pursue penalties, fines, punishment, and sentencing based on, in part, the company's treatment of these issues. Does the company take these issues seriously? Does it address these issues with rigor and with comprehension, or is it just checking the box? So let's talk a little bit about what DOJ and other agencies have said on compliance in the past. So most recently, in the subject of today's thinking and today's analysis is the most recent guidance from April 30th of this year. Released on the 30th, this is guidance, the DOJ's guidance for evaluating corporate compliance programs that's intended for white-collar prosecutors as they determine whether to charge a company, as they determine what's the appropriate sentence to go for, and the like. So while it's intended to be guidance for prosecutors only, this really offers a great perspective for company management, for board of directors, for officers, and for compliance and legal counsel as to what the government's view is about compliance. And really, when you're thinking about enforcement of these laws, the Anti-Kickback Statute, the False Claims Act, et cetera, as we've discussed, the government really is the key stakeholder here. So we want to understand how they're going to look at our programs. Importantly, this is a document that's codified in the U.S. Department of Justice's manual, something to take seriously. This is a guidance that all prosecutors follow at the federal level when pursuing federal criminal and civil matters. So some of the highest level key takeaways, well, I have them listed here. There's no one way or rigid formula to evaluate the effectiveness of a compliance program. We'll talk about what that means. This document itself demonstrates the government's interest in the power of the private sector to root out fraud, waste, abuse, and corruption. And really it demonstrates a continuous shift in the direction of supporting private sector preventative measures. And I would also say one of the top level conclusions or takeaways from the guidance is the fact that they define an effective compliance program as one that is applied earnestly and in good faith. And I can't emphasize enough how this recognition of the subjective element of compliance, the need to apply it honestly, earnestly, and with full faith, is really a inseparable part of appropriate compliance program application. So let's talk a little bit more about the history of the government's statements on evaluating whether a company has an effective compliance program. And over the course of the past nearly 30 years here, the DOJ and the HHS Office of Inspector General have released a series of guidance documents that demonstrates an evolution in thinking on compliance that goes from originally this view of private enterprise as a potential offender to taking the more pragmatic view of the private sector as a partner in crime prevention. And I think that's an important shift and one that really demonstrates the importance of compliance programs, but the impact that compliance programs have had, the evolution of compliance programs over the past few years. Importantly, when Assistant Attorney General Brian Benczkowski released the DOJ compliance program guidance in April, he noted that, and I'm quoting here, the department believes that most companies truly want to be fully compliant with both the spirit and the letter of the law, and they'll take every step necessary to make sure they are developing and implementing compliance programs that are highly effective and sustainable. At the end of the day, the interests of the department and private industry to root out corporate crime are very much aligned, and I hope and know that our collective efforts are having a positive, lasting impact on corporate behavior. So this most recent statement from very late April, early May of this year really shows that pinnacle of the department's trust in private sector compliance to root out these issues. When you turn back to 1991 and the U.S. Sentencing Commission's first introduction of the Business Organizations chapter of the U.S. Federal Sentencing Guidelines, we start to see the government providing some sort of anchor or milestone marker for companies to measure their compliance programs against. For those of you that are unaware, the U.S. Federal Sentencing Guidelines are non-binding rules that set out a uniform sentencing policy for defendants who are convicted in U.S. federal courts. And Chapter 8, which was added in 91, relates to the sentencing of organizations. It lists incentives to organizations that would be used to reduce and eliminate criminal conduct, and it lists what we have commonly known as the 7 elements of an effective compliance program, which we'll explore in a minute. And if an organization was deemed to have an effective compliance program per the sentencing guidelines, there could potentially be a reduction in penalties or the sentence. 2003 was another watershed moment for government statements on compliance. In 2003, the OIG, the United States Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General, one of the key healthcare fraud enforcement agencies, released its own compliance program guidance for pharmaceutical manufacturers, which also applies to medical device companies. And it's specifically intended to lay out a compliance foundation for specific issues that life sciences companies face and address. This guidance has not been updated since 2003. Perhaps it's ripe for an update, but it still provides that foundational direction for life sciences companies seeking to implement and update and enhance their compliance programs. In 2008, we saw the first entrance into the U.S. Attorney Manual, now the Justice Manual, for factors associated with a compliance program to really help the Department of Justice distinguish between what they consider to be a paper program versus one that is designed, implemented, reviewed, and revised in an effective manner. So here, when we first see this, the DOJ issuing its statements and its guidelines on effective compliance, they're focused mostly on whether you have a paper-based program or a real program, a high-level dive or exploration, rather, into compliance. But that's where we start. Is it paper or is it effective? over the course of the next decade, we saw different compliance-related releases from the department. We saw the FCPA guidance document that came out in 2012, a joint document between DOJ and SEC that provided significant FCPA, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act guidance to companies where they had been lacking in that guidance before. We saw in 2015 the issuance of the Sally Yates memo that called for additional individual liability for companies seeking to settle or who would receive some sort of reduction in sentence associated with turning over the names of executives, employees, and others who might be in part responsible for the misconduct. We saw that further revised and narrowed a little bit in November of 2018, about 3 years later, moving from those individuals involved in the wrongdoing to those that were substantially involved in the wrongdoing. But nonetheless, we see this move, these additional guidance statements, these additional requirements from DOJ in support of compliance or that have an impact on compliance. The hiring of Hui Chen in November of 2016 is the first compliance counsel to help assess compliance programs. Ms. Chen has a significant experience in compliance in several sectors. She, after spending some time at DOJ, many of you know, left quite visibly as a result of some concerns that she had with the ethics and compliance issues that in the DOJ itself. And has since become a very well-known speaker and compliance consultant for companies. In February of 2017, and I promise this is the last one that I'll dive into in great detail, the department issued a more extensive discussion of the evaluation of corporate compliance programs to the extent that the substance was so much more deep and rich than had previously been released. We got a really great sense from that guidance of how DOJ might view compliance programs. Then, of course, we had the series of memos that came out over time, the Granston memo, the Brand memo, and the like, that really defined DOJ's enforcement under the False Claims Act and other statutory provisions, and is subject to the Grassley letter that I mentioned earlier today. But all of this shift and this transition, what we see over time, especially over the last 5 years or so, 4 or 5 years or so, is again this move from us versus them, from government versus private enterprise, to government partnering with private enterprise, to the private sector serving as a real tool and resource in eliminating commercial fraud, waste, and abuse. So let's spend a few minutes looking at the last two guidance documents from DOJ on the issue and sort of looking at this structurally from a different perspective. I asked the question on this slide, has DOJ's guidance evolved? We've talked about the evolution over time from 91 to the present, but from 2017 to 2019, what's that evolution look like? So to answer the question, yes, DOJ's guidance has evolved. There are structural changes, which I've highlighted here on the right, that really provide better direction for compliance assessments and strategic planning. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So here, the structural distinction, whereas in 2017, the guidance listed 11 elements and some sample questions under each element. In 2019, DOJ expands that to 12 elements, but divides those elements into 3 fundamental questions. First, is the compliance program well designed? Second, is the compliance program effectively implemented? And third, does the compliance program work in practice? I would also point out that DOJ's guidance really does direct companies to look at the compliance program at the time of the bad acts and the time of the charging decision, or directs prosecutors to look in that direction. But this guidance helps companies as they look to assess their programs through strategic planning, compliance program assessments, annual reporting, and annual planning, and not to mention board reporting and the like. The DOJ guidance from 2019 versus 2017, I think, continues to reflect a more nuanced understanding of compliance programs. They're looking more and more under the hood versus at a set of checkboxes. And it really, as I noted again, and I can't emphasize this enough, I think it really does demonstrate a move towards a practical partnership with private sector compliance. That having been said, though, the 2019 guidance really doesn't offer anything significantly novel beyond 2017, and it doesn't offer sort of a separate support for small companies that are looking to develop compliance programs. But I do think that the structural aspect of it does give companies, whether large or small, some good guidance for how to address compliance moving forward. So reviewing the guidance and its evolution over time in a different way, this slide really shows how the government's statements on compliance have evolved and grown over time. So if you look at just the 7 elements on the left, this was the subject of the sentencing guidelines, subject to the OIG compliance program guidance, and really it was a simple and direct overview of the types of controls that a company would need to pass muster under those documents. But as you think through some of these 7 elements and you think through how the government has relayed these 7 elements, even check-the-box or paper-based programs could potentially pass muster with this sort of simple look at compliance. But this evolution in the guidance really dives deep starting in 2017 and 2019, and it provides an actual structure for a compliance program and for understanding how a compliance program works and should work. The 2017 and 2019 guidance ask a series of questions of prosecutors as they evaluate compliance programs that really, as I noted before, requires them to dig deep, requires them to look under the hood, so to speak, and not just to focus on assessing a program's effectiveness, but really looking at whether the program is comprehensive in design, in implementation, and in practice. Again, it does, from 2017 to 2019, the guidance doesn't change dramatically in terms of substance, but it adds a lot in structure, and these are really key in supporting companies in their compliance program development. What does the new guidance really accomplish? Again, it allows for a deeper, more meaningful assessment of company controls, culture, and protocols. It asks whether the company has actually taken meaningful steps to root out fraud, waste, abuse, and corruption. Has the company's program caught the actual activity here, the actual bad acts here? Were they caught by the compliance program? If not, why not? But importantly, the guidance recognizes that it's okay if it didn't capture that particular bad act or every bad act, so long as the company learns from its errors, incorporates this learning into future training policies and incentives, and keeps the program evolving to address risk. So, talking a little bit about some of the specific conclusions associated with the guidance. And here I've asked the 3 structural questions that DOJ asks: is it well designed, is it effective, and does it work in practice? And frankly, I think as we go through today, we should ask those questions of the DOJ's guidance itself. Has DOJ created well-designed guidance? Is this guidance effective, and does it work in practice? I think it does. I think the answer to those questions are yes. So going through element by element, the first element is the program well-designed. And here DOJ categorizes 6 aspects of this element as going towards the design of the program: the policies and procedures, the risk assessment process, training and communications, the confidential reporting structure and the process used to investigate wrongdoing, third-party management. In other words, how do you manage your relationships with third parties that do business with you and on your behalf? And mergers and acquisitions. When you're purchasing a company, when you're acquired or acquiring a new company, when you're engaging in a joint venture, how does the compliance program come into play there? So the question here is whether the program is adequately designed for maximum effectiveness, and whether the corporate management is actually enforcing the program or pressuring employees to engage in misconduct. So a couple of conclusions about this. Well, the top line question that I have is whether DOJ's assessments, when it applies this guidance to individual companies at the time of charging, at the time of sentencing, at the time of the bad acts, will DOJ make those assessments public, or will they make them available to the defendants in the particular case at issue? That's an important question, one that, to my knowledge, hasn't been answered, although I understand that there have been recent speeches and other public statements made by DOJ officials and others with knowledge who are really examining the DOJ's view of this guidance. But to my knowledge, there hasn't been a statement to that effect. and I'd like to know whether those assessments will be made public or not. Some conclusions about this aspect, about the design aspect. First, companies should really focus on resource allocation. The DOJ emphasizes the need to understand and reallocate and allocate resources from lower risk areas to higher risk areas. They see that as a real priority, a real critical priority for companies. And in fact, DOJ specifically cites to hospitality. It says, are you looking at lower risk items like hospitality, or are you focused on higher risk areas like consulting arrangements, third-party management, mergers and acquisitions, and the higher level risk areas? For our industry, for life sciences, that leaves us in a little bit of a tough spot, because for us, meals, hospitality, business courtesies, again, those types of practices that might be more common in other industries, in our industry require some additional scrutiny. And so as we look to whether our compliance programs are appropriately aligned with the right risk areas, one question is whether hospitality should be considered a lower risk or higher risk area for our industry. Second, incorporate lessons learned and actual instances of noncompliance into the training. The DOJ is really pushing companies to focus on real-life examples of where employees have failed previously, where they have caught bad acts, and why those matter. So to train an employee on a policy is important. To train an employee on how others have previously violated this policy and what the reaction has been from the company, that demonstrates a little bit deeper understanding of the compliance structure and helps employees have a deeper understanding of what the policy is really trying to get at. DOJ also emphasizes the need to tailor training to supervisory employees and gatekeepers. There are some employees who have additional responsibilities, additional approval and certification responsibilities and authority that requires them to have a deeper, more meaningful understanding of the rules and a deeper and more meaningful understanding of the relationships at play. These are gatekeepers for the organization, supervisors, the people that the company enables with a great deal of trust and responsibility. And so to make sure that they, in particular, have a deep understanding is an important aspect of the DOJ's guidance. Some other observations, I don't count these on the top 10, but just some thoughts on the design aspect that I thought were important to point out. First, with respect to culture, the DOJ emphasizes the need to ensure that there's reporting available without fear of retaliation. This is something that we who have been focused on compliance programs have been emphasizing for many years, the need for confidential reporting, the need for employees to feel comfortable that they won't suffer some sort of retaliation, and a culture that is based on speaking up rather than retaliating. Third-party management, this I thought was interesting in this section. One of the only additions from 2017 to 2019 is that companies should have and should exercise audit rights with respect to third-party relationships, third-party sales and marketing intermediaries, for example. This has been long-standing practical guidance and best practice in our industry and others for many, many years. And so it was interesting to me that DOJ added that line, and just recently this year, perhaps they saw that as an oversight from previous years, but something to be aware of. We already talked about training. One of the areas of training that I also think was important beyond just additional training needed for supervisory employees and gatekeepers is this concept that training should be rolled out in a way that avoids linguistic and other barriers. Training alone isn't enough. It has to be accessible training. Investigations. So similarly, the guidance here is not so much focused on the fact that there was an investigation conducted and what were the outcomes and how did the company use them, but in addition to that, DOJ wants its prosecutors to understand the entire environment of the investigations process, to understand not just whether an investigation was conducted, but who decided that the investigation should be conducted, Who decided by whom the investigation should be conducted? What did the results say? How were the results used to further evolve the program and the like? Again, looking under the hood. And then I'd also point out for mergers and acquisitions, another key area of risk, there was no change to the substance from 2017 to 2019. The second question that DOJ asks in its guidance, the second structural question I should say, is whether the program is implemented effectively. Now, technically, the entire guidance document is looking at whether the company has effective compliance, but I think what we're seeing here is a move away from just effective compliance to comprehensive compliance, a broader concept that effectiveness is but one subset of. Now, notably, and I have this circled on the slide here, the DOJ asks, is the program implemented effectively? In other words, is it applied earnestly in good faith? And from my own perspective, when I read this, to me, this demonstrated that the DOJ is really starting to understand what compliance is about. And they've understood compliance, but now they're getting how we in the private sector have to apply compliance. So we've known for years, those of us that do this on a daily basis, that a compliance program is only effective if it's applied in an honest, direct, earnest way, that it's applied with full faith, that it's applied in good faith, and we recognize those subjective aspects of compliance that are equally as important as the objective aspects. You have the right policies, the right training, the right communications, and the like. So to see DOJ focus its definition of what does it mean to be effective on the earnest and good faith application of the program, that says that to me that the Justice Department is beginning to see the work that we are doing and what it really means at the end of the day. So again, here we're looking at whether something's paper-based or applied earnestly, and a couple of conclusions on this section, this structural element of the guidance. I would say first, intent may be the most important aspect of an effectiveness review. As I just said, DOJ makes clear that effective compliance is earnest and good faith, implied in good faith, and it's measured by looking at incentives, discipline, management tone, and program autonomy and resources. And so thinking about this, what are we really saying? We're asking, is this a paper-based program or not? Second, DOJ here really emphasizes the need to raise senior and middle management's compliance profile. DOJ's guidance expands on the role of management in compliance. It's asking whether managers have tolerated greater risks in pursuit of revenues, or have they encouraged unethical compliance, or have they persisted in the commitment to compliance in the face of competing business objectives. And obviously that latter category is what we'd like to see, what we'd all like to see. So really thinking through what senior middle management's profile is, and how they've achieved compliance goals, and how they've addressed compliance risks from a public perspective is important. So in conducting a compliance assessment, the third conclusion here on the list, don't only assess whether you have staffing and resources, but you also need to look at the structure of the program. Where is it housed? Who runs it? Who makes compensation decisions? Who makes hiring and firing decisions? Do staff in the compliance department have competing responsibilities? Why is it set up the way that it's set up? This infrastructure evaluation, including asking why the particular structure is in place versus another structure, really demonstrates that DOJ is looking for a deep dive into not only whether the elements are in place, but how they've been set up and how they've been structured. Sharing actual reasons for disciplinary actions, I referenced this earlier, but the DOJ guidance specifically asks whether a company is sharing the reasons why disciplinary action has taken place, or is a company providing some sort of pretextual reason to protect the company from whistleblowing or other outside scrutiny. This is probably no longer sufficient. I work with companies that struggle with this question quite regularly. We have an employee that's been terminated for violating our compliance policies. It's a very interesting matter. We think that This is something that our other employees would really learn and benefit from, but we're afraid that if we put this information out there that we'll somehow be subject to additional whistleblowing lawsuits or some other sort of scrutiny either from directly from employees or from outsiders. And what DOJ says is, well, that's really no longer a good enough reason not to share the information. And it seems to imply that sharing those actual reasons for disciplinary action may outweigh some of those other issues. Of course, those are questions that should be addressed on a case-by-case basis, depending upon all the facts and circumstances that you might be currently considering. The final category in this structural concept that we're talking about is whether the program actually works in practice. And here, the guidance, this is where the guidance really charges prosecutors to assess a program at the time of misconduct. And here you're looking at whether and how the program detected the particular misconduct, what resources were in place in the time, and the thoroughness of the efforts taken to remediate or mitigate that risk factor. And then also instructs prosecutors to look at the compliance program at the time of charging. And here, prosecutors should look at, has the program evolved over time? Has there been a root cause analysis? Has there been a continuous review? Has there been actual evolution? A couple of conclusions about this section, and then we'll talk a little bit more about what all of this means for compliance planning. But developing rigor around annual compliance reporting that summarizes the company's current status for each program element, this is an area where I really think companies could take the DOJ's guidance, again, intended only for prosecutors, but good perspective on the government's viewpoint, to take this guidance and really establish its compliance program planning arm or branch in a way that could be very meaningful. So just as a prosecutor needs to assess a program at the time the misconduct occurred and the time that the company was charged with the bad acts, that evolution needs to be somehow documented from the DOJ's end. Companies themselves need to document and summarize how their programs change and evolve over time. And we'll talk about some tools that you can use, but I think that these new structures, the three questions that DOJ puts into place in this guidance really provides a nice foundation or a nice structure for that. The DOJ's guidance also lends itself to the conclusion that conducting audits alone is not sufficient. So see an issue, conduct an audit as a reaction or as one of the steps to react to an issue or a particular trend in the data. Yes, that's something that you still need to do, but you really also have to focus on the process for conducting audits. How are they conducted, and what's the rationale for that process? The guidance has really evolved in this area, and it's not just looking at, again, similar to the investigations, it's not just looking at whether it was conducted, but how it was conducted, why it was conducted, who made the decisions about conducting the audit, how was the information that was received as a result of that audit used to further develop and evolve your compliance program. And then finally, incorporating periodic and corporate-wide cultural surveys as part of your compliance program strategic plan and follow-up seems to be part of the guidance on culture. So the DOJ does include a new subsection on the culture of compliance, and it really asks how the company is measuring culture, whether the company is asking for input from all levels about management's commitment, and then even more so, how's the company following up on those cultural surveys? And that all can fall into some of the compliance program planning and assessment that we're going to talk about now. So how does the DOJ's guidance impact MedTech compliance programs? Well, I talk about MedTech compliance programs, we talk about life sciences programs, but really I think this guidance is particularly useful for compliance programs in all industries. But of course, my area of expertise is life sciences and MedTech, so this is what I know, and so we'll focus on this today. But first, just turning back to the government's statements and the guidance about assessing the adequacy and effectiveness of the compliance program over time. We've talked about these two periods of time. First, at the time of misconduct, and again, just to reiterate what the DOJ's guidance says, At the time of misconduct, prosecutors are looking at, did you actually detect the misconduct? What resources were there, and how thoroughly did you follow up or take remedial action on the misconduct? When a prosecutor looks at the compliance program at the time of charging, they're looking at what was the evolution over time, was there some sort of root cause analysis conducted, and how did that pan out? Again, I've got on the screen here the three core questions, the structural elements that I keep pointing to in the guidance. Is the program well designed? Q2, is the program implemented effectively? In Q3, does the program work in practice? And we want to talk a little bit about how that can help direct your strategic plan, annual plan, report, and your compliance program assessment. So strategic planning, some of you probably do this, some of you probably don't. Strat plan or strategic planning is something that the business does regularly. As you all know, it's intended to set organizational and management priorities, focuses the company's resources on the right actions and directives. It strengthens operations by providing that uniform directive to the company, establishes common goals and intended results, and adjusts the company's direction in response to a changing environment. Much of strategic planning is predictive in nature, thus the crystal ball that I have on the screen here, and requires you to really look into the future and think about where an organization is going, the actions that would be needed to make progress in that direction, and how are you going to measure success. Well, that's the same for compliance. A compliance program strategic plan should really match your business's strategic plan. So as the business sits down to map out where it's headed over the next year, 2 years, and 5 years, the company's compliance program should do the same. Where are we going in the next year, 2 years, and 5 years? How much and how quickly does the business plan to expand its employee base, its geographic footprint, new ventures or business models that the commercial operations plan to address? Additional risk areas that the business might take on, new product lines, new industries that the company might want to be involved in. All of these are the questions that the compliance organization needs to address as the business addresses it. So the recommendation that I have as you look at strategic planning moving forward, which really requires a framework of assessing the current internal and external environment. You have to formulate your strategy for compliance, translate it into action items and tactical steps, and then how do you sustain that once you've done it? So you really should try to match this to each of the elements and sub-questions found in the evaluation guidance. So if you're doing your strategic plan and you're focused currently on your training operations, for example, what do you want your training to look like next year? What should training look like in 2 years? What kind of communications should surround that training program? What should it look like in 5 years? And you can address that from the evaluation guidance as well. How are you next year planning on addressing specific gatekeepers and supervisory employees? What are some of the changes that the business plans to make over the next few years? You're going to expand into a higher risk corruption area. Well, what does that mean for your training? What does that need to look like? What communications might need to go out? That expansion might involve taking on a new business, taking on new product lines, which in themselves have different substantive risk areas. Do you need to develop a new training program associated with those? So just trying to understand and address changes in the legal environment, asking where you anticipate the government to expand its enforcement investigative powers, what areas have been hot button topics in public discourse, and where's the industry lost the public's trust. Those are some other questions to ask as you are conducting your strategic planning. Once you have your strategic plan, you need to develop your annual plan. Where are we going this upcoming year? This is the plan to implement the key provisions of your strategic plan. It establishes the tactics and the action items to achieve your strategy. It lays out your needs for resources, creates a more specific roadmap for the year ahead, and talks about and identifies key deliverables and outcomes. So again, you should divide this into each of the elements described in DOJ's compliance program evaluation guidance. Look at that structure and consider the following questions. Which aspects of the compliance program need to be addressed in the upcoming year? We talked about expanding into high-risk corruption zones and training. Well, maybe you're not going to expand for 5 more years, so this upcoming year, do you really need to focus on training in that area? Maybe not, but maybe in your strategic plan, you keep in mind that in 2 years, you're going to have to start planning for those training programs or communications. Where do we see gaps or trends in non-compliance over the last year? So this is where DOJ's guidance that focuses on evolution and change over time can be really helpful. So identifying those gaps that you saw over the previous year, perhaps you saw a trend in an audit of T&E expenditures, for example, that might require some additional tactics to address. Maybe it requires that you look at some of the communications that you're issuing, and that's how you will address it in the plan. But you're able to tick and tie each of your tactics back to the strategic plan. And I think a good practice from a governance perspective here is to consider the compliance committee or the board to have a role in reviewing and approving the annual plan and the annual report. This really keeps them closely apprised to the specific action items that you've undertaken, but it also keeps them at the forefront of making decisions and directions for your compliance program. The annual report, where did we go last year? Now, this goes hand in hand, in my perspective, with the annual plan. So the annual report is going to be a look back to measure the success at achieving your tactical goals laid out in your previous year's annual plan. It tracks whether the organization has met its goals for the year, it describes how the compliance program has evolved for the year, and it covers metrics for training, auditing, investigations, et cetera, for the board and for your executives to understand precisely what you've done and what you've accomplished. And this might be a helpful document when you're facing, and hopefully you never are facing, but when you are facing, or if you're facing the DOJ in an enforcement action, this will give you a really good sense of what the government will uncover as it does its own assessment of your compliance program at the time of charging and at the time of the misconduct, alleged misconduct, I should say. And then finally, your compliance program assessment. So this is a little bit different than your strategic plan. So with your strategic planning, you're looking ahead, you're saying, okay, the business is moving in this direction over the next 5 years. So we as a compliance program are going to move in this direction in the next 5 years. Your annual plan says, okay, next year, these are the tactics that we're going to undertake to achieve our strategic goals. And your annual report says, okay, this is what we did last year and how successful we were. The compliance program assessment is a little bit different. This is a separate exercise that's focusing on purely assessing the structure of your program. It's really asking, what elements of a compliance program do you have in place at this particular time? What elements are we missing? What elements do we have that need to be enhanced? How are they functioning? Do they need improvement? What's the appropriate timing of that improvement? Do we need to do it immediately because it's a higher risk? Can we wait a year? Should we phase it out over the next several years in different stages? And what resources are required? Where do we need additional FTEs? Where do we need additional budget? My recommendation typically is that companies should undertake a compliance program assessment every few years to identify gaps and challenges in your program. And this, again, can be structured following the DOJ's guidance. So you look at the design elements, your policies, risk assessment, training, confidential reporting structure, your management of third-party relationships if you have them, mergers and acquisitions, due diligence, and compliance, to the extent that that's a business practice of yours. The second element is the program implemented effectively. You'd look at your incentives and disciplinary measures, the role of senior and middle management, and specifically how your compliance program is set up and established. Then you might look at whether the program's working in place. You'd want to look at your continuous improvement and periodic testing, look at how you've analyzed and remediated underlying misconduct, and look at how you've investigated that misconduct. Where do we need improvements in those elements? And this, of course, feeds into your strategic and annual planning. If your strategic plan calls for the company to expand its footprint internationally over 5 years into high-risk areas, and you're at year 1 and don't have an international compliance program outside of the United States, well, your compliance program assessment is going to say we need to enhance our policies and procedures internationally, our training and communications, et cetera, but you're going to assess that timing from a different perspective, knowing that you're planning to be there in 5 years. If you're planning to be there in 2 years, you'll assess that timing even differently. And I think the DOJ's guidance here is quite helpful in laying out that structure and some of the questions that you can ask associated with each. Now, many of you know and have attended some of my other Medmarc webinars before. Many of you know that I was instrumental last year in helping AdvaMed revise its code of ethics for the medical device industry. So I'm always focused on industry standards and the role that industry standards can play in compliance. And I think this is an important aspect to raise today as well, just as we get up to the end of our hour here. But as I note on the slide, really, how do industry standards help? Well, they set environmental factors for compliance. They establish the tone of compliance for the industry. So if you're in an industry that's really heavily focused on doing business ethically and with integrity, really focused on having good, strong compliance, that's going to set a different tone for what your work is than if you are working in an industry where a paper-based program might still be acceptable, or where ethics and integrity are an important aspect of what the business does, but the degree of regulation might not be as significant, so you might not have as many policies associated with it. Industry standards promotes that self-regulatory approach and self-regulatory mindset. So just as DOJ has given greater trust to the private sector to root out fraud and abuse and to serve as a partner, we need them to think of us with credibility. And so these industry standards and adhering to these standards give us credibility, give our self-regulatory approach credibility, and really emphasizes that, yes, the Department of Justice can trust that private enterprise will help root out and prevent those issues. And in fact, when you look at the DOJ's guidance, it cites compliance with industry standards as an area of evolution and encourages companies to meaningfully review their programs to ensure that they're not stale. So the first aspect here is helping to develop those substantive rules for compliance. Industry standards also help with values. So I've quoted here the values from the revised AdvaMed Code of Ethics. Again, another plug for our AdvaMed Code. But these core values really help to set the tone for compliance within an organization, within an individual company, and also within an industry. And then one thing that we did as part of our efforts with the AdvaMed Code revision was to add an infographic on the elements of an effective compliance program and resources to help understand and develop the infrastructure around compliance. So whether you're a member of AdvaMed, whether you're a member of pharma, other associations, the work that these organizations do with respect to ethics, integrity, and industry standards for customer relationships and customer interactions is really critical to compliance internally at our companies. So that having been said, I'll turn it over for questions now, but really I think the key takeaways here are focus on the structural divisions that DOJ has established in its most recent compliance program guidance, recognize that the DOJ has been moving in a direction that supports private sector compliance as a real partner in rooting out fraud, waste, abuse, and corruption, that we shouldn't take advantage of that trend and that we should continue in our industry's efforts at developing really meaningful, robust compliance programs through strategic planning, compliance program assessment, and annual reporting. And that we should really be focused on the role of effectiveness, meaning that a program is applied earnestly and in good faith. That's an important aspect of the DOJ's guidance. So with that, I will turn it over to you all to see if you have any questions. Happy to address any of the topics discussed today.
All right, so we'll begin the Q&A session. If you have a question, feel free to submit it using the Q&A panel located at the bottom right of your screen. After typing your question in the space provided, hit the send button, and you'll want to make sure to direct your question to all panelists in that ask menu. So we had a few come in while you were talking, Matt. We'll start off, and this is sort of what you kind of closed on, but what steps should a company take to show that they are following the DOJ guidance on compliance programs?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and the way I might, and I apologize, I might actually change that question a little bit. It's not so much that companies need to follow the DOJ's guidance, so much as the DOJ guidance provides a good roadmap for companies as they look at this issue. A little bit of semantics there, but technically, companies aren't under an obligation to follow it. Our DOJ prosecutors are, but listen, if a prosecutor's following it, then we should be taking a look at it. So I think those structural elements are really the most important aspects, and that's how companies can follow it. So incorporating the specific elements and categorical questions into your strategic plan, into your compliance program assessments, and into your annual planning and reporting, I think would be the most helpful way to apply the DOJ guidance.
Okay, great. And then how about for really small companies? Is there an impact on small private companies of less than 10 employees? And what should small non-public companies do differently in light of DOJ's new guidance?
Yeah, this is not an easy question. So DOJ does not make any dispensations or any exceptions or for small companies in its guidance. And in fact, even in the sentencing guidelines, it references the need for companies, even smaller companies, to have effective compliance programs. That having been said, though, the government is not unreasonable in its expectations, and so it understands that while small companies do need to demonstrate that same degree of commitment to ethical conduct and compliance, these can be met with, and I'm almost quoting the sentencing guidelines here, but can be met in a more informal way or with in a scaled approach that might involve fewer resources. So, for example, you might have a structure that has folks wearing different hats. But so long as you're documenting what those current hats are, you've got a CFO who's also the CCO. You have a head of HR that's also the chief compliance officer. You have a code of conduct that incorporates your policies directly in there. So long as you're documenting what you've done to meet these elements and then showing evolution over time, and that evolution can be a slow growth depending on your company's growth. It could be a rapid expansion depending on your company's expansion, but just demonstrating rigor around documenting what you're doing and where you're going and trying to achieve those results is, I think, a helpful aspect of the government's approach here. But that having been said, small companies, again, aren't given a sort of separate dispensation or the like, but there are steps you can take that allow for achieving compliance goals with fewer resources.
Okay, we'll try to slip in two more here. I know we're kind of tight on time. How does the new guidance apply to digital health products and companies? And what about to artificial intelligence?
So I think that these are really good questions, and I think they're good questions because digital health and artificial intelligence pose different compliance issues. So it's not so much that there's a specific or particular way that DOJ would look at a digital health company or an artificial intelligence company, but the DOJ might examine those customer relationships a little bit differently and the legal risk factors associated with those products a little bit differently. And primarily, and I'm just speaking off the cuff here, I would imagine that the use of patient data would be a significant issue there. So a company that has a digital health or an AI platform, they might have more rigor in their compliance program around the use of data, accessing patient data, using patient data, and how it's used, versus a company that might not be in that space and might not have as much patient data. So while they might have just a policy, an AI or a digital health company might have a full compliance program just around the use of data. So I think it just speaks to the level of risk. Different business environments require different levels of compliance, and companies might find that as they exercise their compliance programs.
Okay, great. Last question. Could you just walk us through how the DOJ compliance program guidance impacts other industries and sectors, and maybe give us an example of how DOJ might use the guidance in another context?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I've been thinking about this issue a lot. I had a great opportunity recently to meet with a group of chief compliance officers in an informal setting, and we talked about sort of, where the industry is, where other industries are, and where we should be looking for the next issues in compliance. And someone made a really prescient comment that I've been thinking about a lot, and that is, well, I would look at where we've lost the public trust. And so from that perspective, I think about if I'm in an industry and perhaps some of the recent headlines in the Varsity Blues case might provide a good example, although I'm not going to comment specifically on those. But where has the public's trust been lost? And then, does an organization in that space need to develop its compliance program around that? Well, if you've lost public trust in, say, for example, a significant trend in bribes in your customer and user interactions, and your industry doesn't have a lot of policies on bribing, that might be an area where you're going to have to focus. And maybe your strategic plan only had a certain areas that you would address over the next 5 years, certain new areas. Well, you have to be nimble, and you have to address those in your strategic plan and your compliance program assessments and the like. So I think there's certainly there's use for this in other industries. And I think if you think of the questions of where have you lost public trust or where have you lost the customer's trust, I think you'll start to see how some of those, if they're novel compliance issues, would require those organizations to shift in a nimble and flexible way.
Perfect. That makes sense to me. And I guess that's all the time we have. But Matt, thank you so much for a great presentation, as always, and really important topic. And I know our listeners enjoyed your presentation, so thank you. Thank you for joining us. This concludes today's webinar.